Yo guys, what up, Viper here, and once again I want to talk about some of the strategies that you can approach in Illuvium's PvP, and today I want to cover a lot of the options that you have if you want to play Mud as the main synergy, the main idea of your team. You want to play around the Monier, the Apon, and the Grilla, the three Illuvials that are made after the Illuvium co-founders, the three Warwick brothers, right? So let's just get right into it. Now, if we're looking at this here, this is kind of just a collection of many of the Illuvials and many of the weapons and ideas that you can kind of go for if you are playing for Mud. Now, why, for example, do I only have 3 Augments here? Well, because your main damage dealers oftentimes in the Mud team will be Monier and Ripplants, or it will be a Grilla and a dagger for Predator, so Predator or Berserker. Now, why are these options and why are attack speed augments good in there? Because the attack speed fundamentally works very, very well with Mud. As we can see, Mud units gain additional energy on attack, and their attacks reduce the attack speed of their target. So if you attack quicker, you get more energy and you slow the attack speed of the enemy quicker. Attack speed, very valuable stat for Mud. And if you want to check out, for example, Berserker, Berserker means every third attack, Berserker units deal increased damage and they gain stacking attack speed for the rest of the combat. So that means if you start out with more attack speed, you do 3 attacks quicker and you get more stacking attack speed quicker, and that means you can keep stacking attack speed quicker and quicker and quicker. And you're fundamentally just an auto attack damage unit, so attack speed is a very, very valuable buff to have there. Which means that why I want to point out on these augments in the team overall, and that's like the only augments I want to point out, because these would be the augments that are not as commonly used, and even playing all 3 of these, very, very good. You want to put only one on an Illuvial though, because they don't work if you put 2. Then only the higher one will count. So on the augment side, the interesting thing in Mud and Berserker especially, put like 1 attack speed augment on each Berserker, each like Grilla, essentially Predator, right, your damage dealers. Now, talking a bit about the team building options and the early game options and such. Now, on the early game options, you essentially can take 2 different paths. One, if you want to play for Mystic, or the other one if you want to play for Toxic in the earlier stages. If you want to be playing for the Toxic opening, then playing, for example, Cardulox and the standard nature/water shield, so you can bond for the Toxic Cardulox, and then you can follow that up with, for example, Arcalion and Null for just a Toxic Colossal Verdant Frontline that is just very, very powerful in the earlier stages due to how good Toxic is. You can check out different videos I made explaining exactly that and different team comps and on the fundamental idea of Toxic being a super, super strong early game trait. And from that point onwards, you can, for example, with the Water Cardulox, switch to an Earth Shield. You maintain Colossus, your Ranger maintains really tanky, and you can start just putting in Mud Illuvials. And you can also start putting in Ripplants once you have the Monier in. So you just start adding in the melee Toxic damage dealers, Mud Berserker, and yeah, you can also stay on the Toxic Ranger if your enemy is a really, really tanky team. So that would be the one line on how to approach the earlier stages of transitioning to your Mud team. It's the usual start, Cardulox into Null Arcalion with the Toxic bonding on the Ranger. And from there on out, you can go to Mud Illuvials and Berserker Illuvials. Speaking Ripplants / all the 3 monkeys in turn 3 and 4, depending on what your opponent has. If you want to play melee damage dealers, if you want to put in the Grilla, if the Apon can maybe get a good stun off, and so on and so on. And that is fundamentally kind of how you want to play that. And then in the later stages, because you're playing towards Colossus in the early games, you can, for example, sell Cardulox, cleanse off the bonding, go for a Water Dagger and bond that to your Grilla. So you have a super, super strong Predator Ranger. Now, it is important to note that if you want to do this Predator play, you usually want to use a Water Dagger for that, because if we check the starting energy in the Water Dagger is 72 and the energy cost is 98. If, for example, you would be doing this with a Earth Dagger, the Earth Dagger has higher defensive stats, in like the physical resistance, energy resistance, but the energy cost on the ability is way, way higher. It's 140. So the Water Dagger is just way stronger at casting more abilities, and a lower energy on the threshold means, well, especially with Mud, your Ranger getting more energy on every auto attack. Your Ranger will be spamming lots of abilities, and for example buffing your Ranger with the lifesteal augments to 2 nearest allies and such. Very, very powerful win condition in the later stages of the game when you can switch your bonding to Predator with that. Then the other late game options, if you're starting out with the Colossals and Verdant lines, are very simply speaking adding in a Mystic Illuvial for, well, Mystic Shield. It's going to be in another attack speed buff. We've already clarified attack speed is very, very valuable on Mud units and on Berserker units. Both very valuable on your Ranger that is becoming a super, super hyper strong carry, especially once you're going for Predator. Or you could also be going for Berserker on your Ranger. It kind of personal preference. I do enjoy the Predator option a lot more because I feel like it gives me more utility in terms of I can jump my enemy, I can force out their positioning and similar, but just going Berserker Ranger also incredibly high on the damage dealing front, especially if you in the late game combine it with Mystic Illuvials like Gazer and Endorius. Or you can just add more tank stats with a Titanor on the essentially Toxic Colossus opening, where you then slowly go towards Berserker and Mud, and then you can slowly add more Mystic and more Colossus to your team. So if you are playing not for the Toxic Cardulox opening line and you want to be playing towards a Mystic bonding, especially in the like early to mid game stages already with your Ranger, so then again for the same reasons with the Water Dagger, that on every water weapon the energy cost is lower and the starting energy is higher on the water weapons. You want to go for a Water Staff and, like, in respect to that, play the Earth Apon, right? The same thing like Earth Grilla, Water Dagger, so you can bond respectively. Now, in that case, you oftentimes can just not play turn 1 because there's no really strong turn 1 play. If your turn 2 goal, essentially, is to go for Apon to bond with the Ranger, that's 65 points, and to play Ripplants and Exalted Monkey to have already 3 Mud and 2 Berserker on turn 2, plus 2 Mystic, so you have just high upfront attack speed buffs, a lot of damage dealing, but, well, you'll probably lose your shields pretty quickly because you don't have a Frontline in play yet, so you don't really have a good turn 1 play, and turn 2 play is okay. It's not bad if you have a good angle on the Berserker Monkey, if Ripplants is attacking, if Apon is getting off a good stun, which Apon has a really high starting energy and you're already at 3 Mud, so Apon will probably get a stun, and you certainly don't have a super weak, you certainly don't have a super strong turn 2. If you go for essentially nothing on turn 1, you can just adjust your positioning perfectly on turn 2. And then you go Apon plus bonding with Apon plus Monkey plus Ripplants. That's one option on how to approach that. And then you can fill that out afterwards with just simply adding Bwalk Illuvials like Caradulo, Kling, and a Grocko, for example, as a cheap turn 3. And then you have a tanky Bwalk frontline, you have added Toxic, you have Berserker, and you have Mystic, and you're also already at 6 Illuvials in play with Mystic AoE shields every 10 seconds. So starting on turn 3, this is going to be an incredibly powerful board. So to recap this again, turn 1, you don't really have a good turn 1 play. Turn 2, you can go for Apon plus bond with Apon plus Ripplants and Monkey. Or instead of Ripplants and Monkey, you can also put in the Bwalk Illuvials, but then you probably just don't have damage and you are not really killing anything. So this can be good against enemy teams that are very rogue heavy, don't really have anything like that. But to reiterate again, standard line, Apon, bond Apon, Monkey, Ripplants, and then turn 3, you put in your Caradulo and Kling and Grocko, just as example Bwalks. The main thing is Caradulo for the Toxic that you then combine with Ripplants, and then you can put in 2 more Bwalks, whatever you like essentially. So after you have pretty much just put up your damage, your Berserkers, your utility, your Mystic, your team buffs, and your tanky stats with the Bwalks, you can follow that up with, for example, Grilla for a Rogue, which is more or less another utility thing, right? Grilla jumping the enemy carry, slowing attack speed, Grilla taunting, jumping around, all of that. Very, very powerful. And you can add another Mystic to your team for more attack speed buff, more shield, and you can just start filling out your team with Augments pretty early on. And at some point in the game, also pretty much how I think it is more or less a standard nowadays, you can, for example, sell your Grokkos to upgrade to other Bwalk units. For example, Stoic Terralinks, very, very tanky, high Bwalk unit, 2100 HP, really good physical resistance stats, gets crit and resolve, and has a AoE stun. So I think if you're just looking for a Bwalk in the late game that doesn't really have utility, just like a really, really big tank, this one would be very, very good, just universally speaking, not 100% on this team, but on this team you're not really having any primary affinities because you're playing for Toxic and you're playing for Mud, and well, you're playing Mystic Illuvials on Endorius and Gazer, so they're not really playing for these initial affinities as well. So therefore, you're just free to choose whatever Bwalk you want to choose, and that would lead you to, for example, the Terra links. Recapping, the second option for essentially how to approach the early game and how to build up your mud teams. You go Mystic, you go Apon plus Mystic bonding on turn 2 with Monier and Ripplants. And then turn 3 you add in Bulwarks, turn 4 you start adding in the Grilla, and you start adding in Augments and more Mystic Illuvials, and eventually you can upgrade your Frontline Bulwark tanks to, for example, Terra links or other options like that. And you just upgrade your Ranger staff. You probably want to position more or less so that your staff can always buff your Berserker's attack speed. That is very, very powerful. So the mud team and all the various approaches you have at playing it, it all kind of leads to you have a frontline, you have high DPS melee damage dealers that are scaling throughout the fight, and with the Grilla and potentially the Predator switch in the later stages of the game with your Ranger, you can really threaten the enemy backline. So it's not very easy for the enemy to win a straight up front to back fight and kill your melee damage dealers with their range damage dealers, as you can kill them with your Predator guys, which makes the team a very well-rounded team. The only thing that's more or less lacking, I would say, is a lot of AoE damage, a lot of AoE crowd control abilities, because outside of some like super late game Null or Titanos scenarios that could be working really well, but people can also play around, or your Exalted Monk, you're hitting a clump of enemies, which frankly speaking your opponent can play around fairly easily. The utility part of the team is relatively low outside of Grilla and the Ranger, so you're just overwhelming them with stats, you're overwhelming them with power level, which is a really good thing to get started with playing the game, because you just do really strong things, and you just do really strong things every turn. You don't have to worry about any of the crazy positionings or angles on target furthest ability kind of things. So very well-rounded team, very high power level on like the pure amount of stats that you throw at your opponent, and it's very hard to deal with by just trying to play front to back, because Grilla and Ranger super hard to deal with. Now I think I'm more or less repeating myself on the fundamental ideas and strategies of the team, so let's quickly look a little bit into other augment options that you have and how they can work. So because you're playing in the cheaper Bwalk version, you're playing a relatively cheap team, and that team augments like the Biogenic Suppressor, that are just like team-wide debuffs to the enemy, either to their healing or to their energy gain. Very powerful. If you play the more Colossus-oriented version, then this can be helpful in something like a Invoker matchup, because that could be a really difficult matchup to handle. Outside of that, though, it is very expensive to fit utility augments like this when you're playing towards the Colossus and not towards the Bwalk option. If you're stacking with your Ranger and all your Illuvials are kind of clumping together anyways, there's a lot of AoE that can punish you for that in the game, but there are also augments like this that can buff you AoE, Grit, and Resolve. So if you want to play stacking around your Ranger, and utilizing this Arcanite shield, maybe stacking around Archelion heals and similar like that, then playing Exalted Fortification Catalyst is going to be very good in your mud teams, the same way it is good in any kind of like clump together team, because then your opponent's AoEs are going to be a lot less effective. If you're just looking for a standard defense augment that is always playable, always okay, I'm really a fan of the Neogenic Recombinator augments, mainly on the your team gains 200 max health option, because if you had 8 Illuvials and you play plus a Ranger, 200 max health on 9 units is 1800 health. That is just making your whole team a whole lot more tanky, and maybe it makes them live for the next Mystic Shield, and lives for the next ability, lives for the next scaling on the Berserker attacks, and so on and so on. So that is a very nice universal choice you can go for at that point. Then, especially because we are playing melee damage dealers, the standard lifesteal augments, the standard omnivamp augments, meaning if they deal damage, they heal for a portion of the damage they do. Omnivamp meaning both for auto attacks and abilities. Well, very good. Oftentimes just choose 2 nearest allies, gain X amount of Omnivamp, because you probably want to buff both your Monier and your Ripplants if they're on the same side of the board, if they're on opposing sides of the board, or if you just want to have a really strong turn, really high survivability on one of them, can give one single of them for the resistance as well. Fundamentally speaking, these augments are very, very good in mud teams moving forward, that they reduce the resistance of the enemy team every 1 second. So it's kind of like a continuous aura effect, reducing resistance, meaning a damage buff, but you don't have to put it on your melee damage carries. You can though. Honestly, it's a very effective damage and boost augment to put on melee carries, melee damage dealers in general, but I believe that currently in the game it's not working as intended and it's only reducing base and not bonus resistances, so it is not as good of a counter to any of these Bwalk and Colossal Illuvials as it should be. In the future, once it does its job, a very, very S-tier class option for augments in this team for both Predator and Berserker Illuvials, as much as just for tanks to support them. Now, something really interesting on augments like Exalted, Reactive, Reflector. If you're playing the small Bwalk line, the 6 invulnerable second option is very, very good in the later stages of the game, because you don't have that much of a super strong frontline if you're playing like only 3 small Bwalk Illuvials compared to maybe 3 big Colossal Illuvials. So augments like this can help making up for that. And if you're playing on the Colossal side of things, the 40 Fawns option can be really, really helpful versus high damage, low health, like fighter and rogue oriented teams on, for example, your Cardulox or your Titanor, so that your tanks, by sheerly surviving, can also start dealing a lot of damage. On the same note, on the tank surviving more on the Colossal side of things, at 60% health, gain health regen, very, very good for your Titanor, your Cardulox, your Null to survive, and it can enable you to play a more toxic oriented win condition line as well. If, for example, you get a legendary augment that gives you +1 toxic, 4 toxic being incredibly strong, if you can play for more survival in the Colossus line, that can be a very, very strong win condition. Then we go to our classic Exalted Siphon Matrix augment options. Both of these options are very, very good because you're playing melee damage dealers. They're gonna have to walk to the front line, walk up to the enemy tanks, and they can probably get crowd controlled, get stunned, get debuffed, all of those things. So taking energy away from the enemy front line can be very, very effective, especially in combination with biogenic suppressors that then also make it more difficult to regain that energy. Or combining, for example, with your Grilla as a super heavy debuff Illuvial, jumps to the enemy, slows the attack speed with the Augment, slows the attack speed with Grilla's auto attacks, pretty much even without maybe killing the backline Illuvial that maybe has some dominative and defensive augments. You just take it out of the game by just reducing the attack speed to almost 0 with it. So very universally strong augment to have, especially if you're playing any kind of rogues in your teams. And then a really strong last mention, not the last mention, but one of the last mentions, is the Exalted Temporal Safeguard option, because a cleanse and become immune for 4 seconds on Omega can be really, really good on especially Ripplants. Ripplants, the Illuvial with the cheapest Omega in the game. Your Ripplants is continuously gonna be cleansed and immune. By the way, again here, I think the cleanse part on the augment currently is not working as intended. It is only the immune part that is working, but that is good enough for Ripplants because it's just going to be continuously immune, meaning it can't get crowd controlled, it can't get debuffed, nothing bad can happen to it, especially if you're playing a mud versus mud kind of team. The mud versus mud kind of matchup. Being immune and having your Ripplants not be attack speed slowed is incredibly powerful, and it's gonna probably win you the matchup almost every single time if your opponent doesn't also do this. On the other note, 35% damage reduction on Omega can also be very helpful on Ripplants, as that could just be a very good defensive options for your hyper carry to just survive. And then I think honorable mention, because I like this augment a lot, I think it is very versatile, the Vitality Veil line of augments. At 50% health, they can give you health regen and energy regen, or they can make you untargetable for 6 seconds. So this can be very, very good to stay safe from enemy focus fire, Illuvials, enemy focus fire damage, because being untargetable, well, they can't target, they can't attack you anymore. Or the other option of health regen and energy is very, very universally useful, because, well, your Ripplant's getting more energy. That's not a bad thing. It deals more damage, it gets some healing, that's okay. Your Dorios, your Titanor, your Archelion, your Cardulox, like no matter what, gaining energy and gaining health regen is a very, very good combination. Maybe it can help your Null get a clutch, or your Cling even, right? Both Null and Cling, kind of same ability, disrupt the enemy, very, very good. Or you give super high survivability to your Dorios, for example, or you can get a really early Titanor Omega out, and so on and so on. I think very, very high value augment that is very, very versatile. So I think this concludes my introduction to most of the synergies, most of the things that you need to know if you want to start playing around with the monkeys, with the mud Illuvials, and you want to, yeah, just play another really powerful team where you can just overwhelm your opponents with the sheer amount of power and stats and debuffs and everything you're throwing at them. It can be really fun to play. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you will enjoy playing around with these different team options, and see you guys in the next one.